Hi, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. Today I am making my gingerbread dough. You know that dough that goes into all of my 3D cookies, my contoured cookies? Well, many of you have been asking for it time and time again, and I've held out to this point because the dough is so darn easy to put together. I just didn't think it merited a video. So I didn't want to let you down, so we are going to do the recipe today, but I'm going to augment it with some other technique tips, and those technique tips relate to how to keep the dough from spreading. It's very important to have a non-spreading dough when working with 3D and contoured cookies. So I want you to understand what variables in this recipe make this dough ideal for that type of work so that you can then go look at other dough recipes and perhaps adapt them for your own use. So let's get started and talk about the ingredients that go into this recipe. All of the exact measures will be in the video description. So if I say something in the video that's contrary to what's in the video description, rely on what's there because chances are I've tripped up. I do know the recipe quite well. I make it almost every day, but I don't always know the measurements by heart. So the recipe basically starts by creaming sugar, 1 cup, with 1 cup of Crisco, which is hydrogenated vegetable oil, and 1 egg. That's all easy, 1, 1, 1. It calls for 5 cups of flour. We're going to talk about the importance of measuring flour, whether to weigh it or to scoop it, and what impact that has on the recipe in a bit. Lots of spices in this recipe. We've got about a teaspoon of ground cloves, a teaspoon and a quarter, I believe, of ground cinnamon, and 2½ teaspoons of ground ginger. Also a little salt to heighten the flavor. Now the leavening in this recipe, what makes it rise a little bit, is baking soda. I've got 1½ teaspoons. And baking soda is activated through the use of an acid. So in this case, we're adding 2 tablespoons of vinegar to activate the soda. If I were to leave the vinegar out, I know it sounds crazy to have it in there, but if I were to leave it out, you'd get absolutely no rising of the dough, which is good if you want a non-spreading dough, but you'll end up with a really tough cookie that way. So I always want a little bit of leavening in there to give it just enough rise and tenderness, but not too much to cause the dough to spread. The other liquid element that goes in is molasses. Now, a couple of these ingredients are tough to find in other countries, and I've discovered this when traveling across the globe teaching classes. One is molasses, and the other is vegetable shortening. So at the end, I'm going to show you some quick substitutions that make this recipe work anywhere across the world. So let's get started mixing the dough. So the first step in any recipe is to mise en place, in my kitchen that is. And mise en place in French means to put in place, and that literally means measuring everything out into its individual container before you dump it in the mixer. I don't know how many times you've started a recipe and you've gotten halfway through and you've forgotten what you've put in. Well, this makes sure that you've always got a correct starting point and you're less likely to make a costly mistake once things get in the mixer. The most important ingredient to actually weigh and measure properly is the flour. If you have too much flour in the recipe, it's going to end up being very, very dry, and you're going to have a hard time getting it around contoured surfaces without it cracking. If you don't have enough, it's going to be relatively soft and it will spread a lot more. So there's an optimum measurement for this recipe, and I'm going to show you how you can get very different weights of flour in the recipe depending on how you actually measure it into your measuring cup. And there's a particular way that I measure into the measuring cup to make sure that I get the optimal weight. So before we start weighing the flour, just a thank you to Mandy Rice for this lovely Live Sweetly towel. I'm going to be using it throughout this video as a special gift that came this week, and I love it. I just don't want to get it too dirty, so I'm a little afraid to use it. So I'm going to show you how I actually scoop when I don't have a scale and what that equates to in weight, and then how that's different if you scoop in different ways. So if you read my recipe, it says to spoon the flour, unsifted flour, straight from the bin into the cup. And I also lightly tap it once or twice, 3 times at the most, to remove any big voids of flour, and then level it with a spatula, like so. This will result in about 5.1 ounces of flour, which is the optimum amount for this recipe. And just to verify that, we're going to dump it into this bowl that's been zeroed out on the scale and see what the scale reads. And it's weighing 5 ounces. So if you don't have a scale to weigh out 5 ounces per every cup of flour in this recipe, then measure it as I just measured it here. So I'm just dumping that back in because I'm going to show you now if you're to measure it a different way, not the way I suggest measuring it, what a different quantity you'll actually get in the recipe. And a matter of 1/4 of an ounce to an ounce of flour makes a huge difference in the recipe, especially when you're multiplying a cup of flour by 5 for this recipe. So one other common way people measure is to plunge the cup into the flour, like so, which really compacts the flour. They might also additionally tap it down a bunch of times to make sure it's really all in there and then level it out. And that's going to compact the flour and give you more flour by weight, more like 5.6 ounces, and a much drier dough. So that's not the way to measure. I'm going to show you one other not way to measure, and that's to sift the flour first and then put it into the measuring cup. My recipe calls for unsifted flour, and there's a reason for that. I'm going to sift more than I need into the bowl and take from there. Okay, that should be pretty good. Now let's say you were to scoop and scrape sifted flour. This is going to be a lot more airy, more aerated, and less compact, and so you're going to end up with less flour, probably substantially by weight, than if you were to measure it my way, unsifted first. Not tapping it down, just leveling it out. And let's see what we get now on the scale. That results in about 4.5 ounces of flour. And again, multiplied by 5, that's a substantial amount of difference that will cause your dough to be very, very soft. So let me go ahead and properly weigh out my flour, or scoop unsifted flour, lightly tap it and level it, and get all 5 cups of my flour mise en place. Okay, I've got my 5 cups of flour properly measured and mise en place. So I'm just going to combine all my dry ingredients now. Cinnamon, ginger, cloves. The good thing about this recipe, if you don't want it so spicy, just take the spices out and you'll have a much more mild dough. That was my baking soda and my salt. And I do like to take a whisk to this just to evenly distribute the dry ingredients before we add them into the mass of stuff that's going to be in the mixer. And now we're going to move the mixer over and do the very first mixing step in the mixer, which is the creaming of the shortening and the sugar and the egg together. Okay, so ready to add the Crisco. I've got a cup pre-measured in these stick forms, but if you don't have this, you're drawing out of a big tub. That equates to about 6.7 ounces. And again, I have all the weight equivalents in the recipe in the link in the video description. And it goes, we're going to start by creaming it with the 1 cup of sugar. And I'll get that started and then I'll pop the egg in. I only cream for about 1 to 2 minutes. I don't want to incorporate a lot of air because that will also increase the spread of dough. So 1 to 2 minutes max. Once I've got that basically together, I'm going to have to scrape in some of the dry stuff at the bottom because my blade's not going all the way to the bottom. I'm going to pop in the egg. So I've got it about medium speed. And that's really all I need to do in terms of mixing it with shortening. I don't really want it any lighter and fluffier than that. And shortening's so creamy to begin with. When I talk about substitutes later where I'm using coconut oil, it's very, very hard to start at room temperature, so you're going to have to cream it a lot longer to get any little chunks of cocoa butter worked out and smooth. So in goes that 2 tablespoons of vinegar. Reminder, that's the activator of my leavening, which is baking soda in this recipe. Basically a combination of acid and baking soda makes baking powder. And in goes my molasses. This is a mild molasses, not a blackstrap molasses. Every molasses has a different water content, so if you use a different one, you might end up with a softer or stiffer dough. So try to use a mild molasses if you can. I use Grandma's brand. I'm going to give that a stir to get it started and then just combine it nicely. This keeps the vinegar from slopping around because it's rather loose, and then combine it more uniformly on the mixer. It's very fragrant. A really rich caramel brown color. I love it. And that looks nice and smooth. And now is the time for the dry ingredients. Because I'm used to working on my Hobart, which is much bigger, I'm going to give the dry ingredients a stir by hand in here before I get the blade going again, just so I don't potentially get flour everywhere. Because this bowl is a little smaller than I'm accustomed to working with. It should fit it all, however. And I'm going to do that gradually. We'll definitely want to finish it with the paddle attachment because the dough blends very, very stiff, as you'll see, to a point where it's almost rollable right off the mixer, but I like to wrap it in plastic and foil and refrigerate it for at least a few hours, if not even longer, because that allows the spices to kind of meld and really saturate the dough, if you will. I think that's probably good enough that I can put my paddle attachment back in. And now I'm going to finish off all the real heavy-duty mixing with the paddle attachment on medium speed. And you'll notice it'll come together in a nice round ball. And that's about all I need to do. I don't want to overmix it. You can activate the gluten in the dough and make it a little tough. It's a little hard to do that with cookie dough because it's got so much sugar in it, which is a tenderizing agent, but nonetheless, just till it comes together. So I want to get every delicious morsel of this dough off the paddle attachment before I show you how I wrap it up, both for refrigerator storage and also for the freezer. I do it exactly the same way. I often make this dough well in advance, 2 to 3 months before I need to use it, and store it in the freezer. Just thaw it in the fridge overnight and it's ready to go, and very little diminishing of the spice flavor, even in a 2 to 3 month period. Okay, so you can see the texture of this dough is nice and soft, malleable, easily comes together in a ball. Some people have mentioned that when they've made this recipe, it's been dry, and all I can guess is that you measured the flour the wrong way, maybe compacted it too much, did the thing that I told you not to do at the beginning of the video, or you made an ingredient substitution that I wasn't aware of. I'd like to flatten it into a disc because it's just easier to handle when it comes out of the fridge or freezer that way, and I want to take it directly into rolling. I want to wrap it a couple of times in plastic, and then I ultimately wrap it in foil because the plastic's a little permeable. If I were to put this straight in the freezer or fridge, it would dry out over time. The foil keeps it nice and protected. If you want to go even the extra mile, you could put that all into a baggie, but usually the foil is adequate. And you'll see the quantity of dough this makes and how many cookies it bakes. I've got a yield in the link in the video description. I like to always label it up. What's today? And just date it so that I'm always pulling the oldest dough out of the refrigerator first. So with the dough all mixed and wrapped and put away, I want to talk about the variables that affect spreading of the cookie dough. Because as you know, when we're doing tight-fitting 3D constructions or contoured cookies, the less the dough spreads, the better. There are a number of factors related to the recipe that contribute to the spreading or lack of spreading. Actually 3. The first is the ratio of flour to fat. This dough is inherently non-spreading, and that's partly because it has a relatively high ratio of flour to fat. It's about 4 to 1 by weight. So if you're finding your own dough that you love is spreading too much, try adding more flour relative to the fat, and that could very well solve the problem. The second variable is the type of fat. I'm using 100% shortening in this recipe, as opposed to, say, butter or some mixture of butter and shortening. And butter has a lower melting point and a higher water content than shortening. What those two variables mean is that it is going to spread more before the dough sets because the butter has a lower melting point. So the more butter you have in a dough, the more spreading it tends to be, keeping all other variables the same. So in working with shortening, I've really also controlled the spreading in this particular recipe. The downside is it doesn't have quite as much flavor. It does make a crispier dough in my opinion, and I do love it in this particular recipe. The third variable is the leavening and how much of it you have. This recipe calls for 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda. And sometimes I do find that if I'm working on a very, very tight construction, I like it to spread a little less than it normally does, so I cut the leavening in half. And I just want to show what impact that has on spreading with some real live examples in front of me. I've got domes, circles, and squares. These in this column were cut out of dough that had the full amount of leavening in it, all 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda. These were cut out of one where I halved it. And it may be hard to see, but this dome spread more towards the bottom of the dome. Originally it started out somewhere up here and is kind of drooping down here, whereas the one with less leavening is sort of more uniform all the way around. But both are equally workable for a contoured cookie. I just have to file this one a little bit more. Moving on to the circles, both of these doughs were rolled to 1/8 of an inch thickness, so we had the thickness of the dough controlled for, and I know that because I rolled them with rolling guides. And then I cut them with the exact same cookie cutter. So as you can see, this one spread a little bit, not a lot. As I said, my dough performs pretty well, especially on round shapes. However, this one spread virtually not at all. It's almost the exact same size as the cookie cutter. Now, I know squares and angular shapes sometimes confound us because they have a tendency to bulge and spread more away from the corners, so they end up looking less square and more round at the end of the day. And you can see a little bit of that happening with the square I cut out of the dough that had the full amount of leavening. It spread a little bit beyond the cutter. In addition, it's kind of bulging here in the centers of the sides. When I cut the leavening in half, again, rolling them both to the same thickness, virtually no spreading whatsoever. It almost fits the cookie cutter perfectly. So on boxes, tight angular constructions, anything I want zero spread on, I will have the leavening. Now I'm going to move on and talk about non-recipe related factors that impact spreading. So I mentioned that there were process steps that also impact spread, and the primary one is really how thick do you roll the dough. I tend to roll relatively thin, about 3/16 of an inch thick, to prevent a lot of spreading when I'm working on 3D pieces. However, a lot of people will roll thicker. In fact, there are rolling guides made to 1/4 of an inch thick, which is almost too thick for me. And I just want to show you the impact that rolling to a different thickness has on my gingerbread dough. This column has a gingerbread dough with the normal amount of leavening, the full amount of leavening. Here is the column with half the amount of leavening. So I think it's clear that the one that held its shape best and comes closest to the cutter size is the one that uses half the amount of leavening and is also rolled more thinly. Even this one has spread a little bit. This one was rolled to 1/4 of an inch thick. And the most spreading probably is the thick one with the full amount of leavening. I'm just gauging that by how much cookie is showing around the edge of the cutter. So you're not completely out of the woods even if you have a well-formulated recipe. You need to roll your dough to a certain amount of thickness so that there's not so much mass of dough that it overexpands, spreads, and causes problems. And you'll see much more spreading and cracking if you roll this thick on a domed surface than you would on a flat surface. So as you've seen in my last two segments, I've got a really well-formulated gingerbread dough that doesn't crack or spread too much, even on contoured surfaces. And I know that makes some of you jealous when you can't find the ingredients that I use or all of the ingredients that I use in your home countries. So I took it upon myself to explore substitutions for the least common ingredients across the globe and to devise a recipe that would work just about anywhere in the world. So what I've done is I have substituted for the molasses honey in equal amounts by weight. And for the shortening, which many of you don't have, the Crisco, I have substituted coconut oil, which is a solid fat at room temperature. And again, I've substituted the exact same amount by weight. One thing to note is the coconut oil, depending on your room temperature, can be really, really solid and chunky at a cool room temperature. It's not nearly as smooth as or as homogeneous as shortening. So you want to take extra care to really cream it well, as I noted earlier, or you're going to end up with some chunks in your dough. And just to point that out, in this dough here, which is my test dough number 3 to get technical, I've got chunks of unmixed in coconut oil. It might look pretty harmless in dough form, but it's going to wreak havoc once we bake this dough. Conversely, this dough is a lot more smooth textured simply because I creamed it a lot longer to work out those hard kernels of coconut oil. Alternatively, you could set this in a warmer space. The melting point of coconut oil is about 76 degrees Fahrenheit, so it will soften and be much easier to cream if you soften it up a little bit first. So while we're on the topic of melting point, that 76 Fahrenheit I just mentioned, that's a lower melting point than Crisco and a lower melting point than butter. It's also got a higher water content than Crisco does, something like 6% as opposed to 0%. So I would have supposed making the same substitution 1-for-1, this dough might spread a lot more than my regular gingerbread dough. However, honey, believe it or not, actually has a lower water content than molasses, so perhaps those two factors will counterbalance each other and we'll get a relatively non-spreading dough. So I wanted to test that all for you, and I'm going to show you that in the next little short segment. So let's see how that honey dough turned out in terms of spreadability, shall we? First, let me orient you to what's here. I've got, again, my regular gingerbread dough with the full amount of leavening, my regular gingerbread dough with half the amount of leavening. This was my test batch 3 I mentioned earlier, where I hadn't mixed in the coconut oil very well. It has the full amount of leavening. And this is my last and final test 4 batch where I mixed the coconut oil in better, but I also halved the leavening. And let me just point out a few things. The most obvious one is, of course, color. Without the molasses, the dough is going to be a lot blonder. It's also going to be sweeter and smell, well, honey-like. The other obvious difference is there's a ton of pitting, especially on this domed piece, but also along the edges of this piece and here and here and here. And those are all areas where that coconut oil wasn't well distributed and it just melted and left a big pocket in the dough. So while the dough looked relatively normal, those little chunks we saw earlier really did wreak havoc on this particular set. What I think you'll also notice is that this indeed is probably the most spreading of the 4 doughs. Again, it has the full amount of leavening in it, and that's probably because the melting point of my fat here is so much lower, and it also has a higher water content than the shortening. So what I thought might be the case actually was the case. And just to verify that, if I put that round cutter on here, you'll see there's quite a bit of distance around it, even as compared to the gingerbread here that has the full amount of leavening, and certainly as compared to the one that has half the amount of leavening. But the good news is when I have the leavening in the honey dough, it performs nearly as well as either of my gingerbread tests. Very little spread when rolled thin. Nice uniform shape when I've mixed in the coconut oil properly. A little bit more spread when it's rolled thickly, but that's the case with all of the scenarios. And very little spread even on the square piece. So at the end of the day, if you don't have molasses and you don't have shortening, this recipe is completely doable, but I would recommend having the leavening in all cases, particularly if working with contoured cookie shapes and things requiring tight-fitting constructions. I hope you learned a lot about my gingerbread recipe and also found a recipe that will work for you no matter where you are in the world. Till next video, live sweetly. Thanks again, Mandy.